Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The historical information, legal context, and financial discussions presented in this video are intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes only. We will be examining the historical trends of family law, divorce proceedings, alimony structures, and economic survival strategies during the 1930s. Nothing in this retrospective should be construed as professional legal, financial, psychological, or tax advice. Family law and economic regulations have evolved drastically over the last century, and current statutes vary wildly by jurisdiction. If you are navigating your own family law matters, financial restructuring, or dealing with emotional distress today, it is imperative that you conduct your own due diligence and consult with licensed professionals, such as attorneys or financial advisors, in your specific area. We are looking back at historical case studies to understand societal shifts, not to provide a blueprint for modern legal strategies. Picture the year 1932. The United States is caught in the suffocating grip of the worst economic collapse in modern history. A staggering 25% of the American workforce is completely unemployed. Breadlines stretch around city blocks, banks have shuttered their doors permanently, and the industrial roar of the Roaring Twenties has been replaced by the deafening silence of idle factories. Now imagine navigating this apocalyptic economic landscape, not just as an unemployed man, but as a divorced father carrying the crushing weight of court-ordered financial obligations that are mathematically impossible to meet. We often hear about the Dust Bowl, the Hoovervilles, and the stock market jumpers, but there is a massive forgotten demographic of the Great Depression that history has largely swept under the rug: the legally divorced American father. Here is a shocking historical reality that shatters our conventional understanding of the era. Between 1929 and 1933, the official legal divorce rate in the United States actually plummeted. On paper, to a casual observer or a government statistician, it looked like the severe economic hardship was miraculously keeping families together. It appeared as though couples were forcing themselves to weather the catastrophic storm under one roof out of sheer financial necessity and traditional duty. But beneath that sanitized government data was a terrifying, silent epidemic of what social workers of the era grimly referred to as the poor man's divorce. Over 1.5 million married men simply vanished. They walked out of their front doors, ostensibly to look for work, and never returned. They left their families behind because the legal mechanisms of a formal divorce were far too expensive, requiring steep attorney fees and court costs, and the societal shame of failing as a sole provider was too absolute to face daily. But what about the men who did not run? What about the fathers who stayed, navigated the labyrinthine, highly stigmatized, and unforgiving legal system of the 1920s and 1930s, and became officially legally divorced? Their stories represent one of the highest-stakes battles for survival in American history, yet they are entirely absent from our modern history textbooks. Consider the historical trends regarding child custody and alimony during this period. The legal framework of the time operated almost exclusively on the tender years doctrine, a powerful legal principle that overwhelmingly presumed mothers were the natural, moral, and default custodians of children. Divorced fathers were routinely stripped of primary custody by judges and simultaneously burdened with rigid, unyielding alimony and child support decrees. Here is the fatal flaw in that system. These financial orders were calculated during the wildly prosperous years of the late 1920s, based on robust salaries and booming businesses that simply no longer existed by 1931. When the stock market crashed and the economy imploded, the courts were shockingly merciless. There were no widespread government stimulus checks to bail out individuals, no robust unemployment insurance safety nets, and absolutely no legal mechanisms to easily or swiftly modify a divorce decree, just because the entire global economy had collapsed. If a divorced dad could not pay his court-ordered alimony because his factory shut down or his trade was rendered obsolete, he was not met with institutional empathy or leniency. He was met with a warrant for his arrest. Across major American metropolises like New York and Chicago, a dystopian phenomenon known as the alimony jails swelled with inmates. Men were thrown into county lockups for contempt of court, forming bitter fraternities behind bars. They were locked in a Kafkaesque paradox. They could not earn money to pay their court-ordered debts because they were locked in a jail cell, and they could not legally leave the jail cell until they paid their debts. This created an endless, inescapable cycle of institutionalized poverty and psychological torment that drove many capable, hard-working men to absolute ruin. This historical reality forces us to ask an incredibly uncomfortable, but necessary question about the fragility of the social contract. What happens to the structure of fatherhood, legal obligation, and male identity when the economic foundation of a society entirely evaporates overnight? The historical case studies we will uncover in this deep dive reveal a raw, unfiltered look at human endurance under the pressure of the state. We are going to examine the localized, desperate legal battles where men fought against the rigid family courts of the 1930s. We will look at the psychological devastation of losing both one's livelihood and one's children simultaneously, and the desperate, often tragic lengths to which divorced fathers went to maintain a shred of their dignity and freedom in a society that aggressively categorized them as ultimate moral and financial failures. For the modern American audience, understanding this hidden chapter of history is not merely an academic exercise or a simple history lesson. It is an absolutely critical lens through which we must view our current societal and economic landscape. Today we are witnessing unprecedented, rapid shifts in the global economy. We are dealing with severe fluctuations in the cost of living, massive corporate and tech sector layoffs, soaring inflation, and a rapidly evolving landscape of family law and father's rights activism. The quiet, persistent anxieties surrounding modern fatherhood, economic stability, and legal fairness in family court are not new phenomena. They are the exact same battles fought by men nearly a century ago, just dressed in different clothes and mediated by different technologies. By dissecting these historical trends and deeply examining the structural, catastrophic failures of the 1930s family court system during times of ultimate national crisis, this masterclass promises to equip you with a profound, structural understanding of how economic macrocycles directly impact the micromechanics of the American family. We will carefully deconstruct the mechanisms of survival these men utilized to stay out of the alimony jails, how the societal definition of what makes a good father was forcibly and painfully rewritten by systemic poverty, and how the legal system eventually, albeit reluctantly, had to adapt to macroeconomic reality. You will begin to see the direct, undeniable lineage between the forgotten, imprisoned fathers of 1932 and the ongoing, highly contested debates surrounding shared parenting presumptions, lifetime alimony reform, and financial equity in divorce courts today. This is not just a story about the distant past. It is a vital exploration of the potential outcomes when extreme, unforeseen financial pressure collides with the uncompromising machinery of family law. By providing you with this critical historical perspective, you will be vastly better equipped to navigate the economic shifts, legal structures, and social uncertainties of our own era. This sweeping journey into the shadows of the Great Depression will fundamentally, permanently change the way you understand the delicate intersection of money, the law, and fatherhood in America. Let us step directly from that broad overview into the claustrophobic reality of a courtroom in 1931. To truly comprehend the devastating historical trends we are dissecting, you must understand the absolute rigidity of the legal machinery operating during the American Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929, erasing billions of dollars in wealth practically overnight, the judicial system did not simultaneously crash or pause or reset its expectations. The family courts, operating under precedents set during a decade of unparalleled economic boom, remained entirely static. They functioned on the rigid assumption that a man's earning potential was a constant, unbreakable upward trajectory. Imagine a scenario that played out thousands of times across the country. We will look at a representative case study based on the historical records of the era. Consider a man named Arthur, an auto parts salesman living in Chicago. In 1928, Arthur earns a very comfortable middle-class salary of $3,000 a year. His divorce is finalized that same year under the widely accepted tender years doctrine, which automatically awards primary custody to the mother. The judge, looking at Arthur's robust income, orders him to pay $1,000 a year in alimony and child support. At the time, this is a hefty but manageable sum. Arthur can pay his obligations, maintain a modest apartment for himself, and move forward with his life. But then the calendar turns to 1931. The banks fail. The auto industry grinds to a catastrophic halt. Arthur loses his job. His savings evaporate in a bank run, and he is suddenly thrust into the ranks of the 25% of unemployed Americans. He is destitute, standing in soup lines just to survive. Yet, according to the state of Illinois, Arthur still owes $1,000 a year. When Arthur desperately petitions the court for a modification of his decree, pleading that his income has dropped to zero, the judicial response is shockingly callous. Judges of this era consistently ruled that economic downturns were temporary fluctuations, and that a man simply needed to work harder to find employment. The legal system effectively imputed income to Arthur that simply did not exist anywhere in the devastated national economy. When Arthur inevitably misses his payments, his former spouse, who is likely equally desperate and facing starvation herself, utilizes the only tool the legal system provides. Her attorney files a motion for civil contempt of court. This is a critical legal distinction to understand. Arthur is not being charged with a crime like theft or assault. He is being charged with civil contempt for disobeying a judge's order. Because it is a civil matter, Arthur is not entitled to a public defender. He cannot afford an attorney to argue his case. He stands alone before a judge who looks at the arrears, strikes the gavel, and orders the sheriff to take him into custody until the debt is paid. This legal mechanism created one of the most absurd and destructive paradoxes in American legal history: the alimony jails. Major cities like New York and Chicago maintain specific wings of their county lockups, exclusively for men who could not pay their divorce decrees. In New York City, the Ludlow Street Jail became infamous. The press mockingly referred to these lockups as the Alimony Club. But there was absolutely nothing exclusive or glamorous about this club. Let us deeply examine the sheer logical fallacy of this system. The state locked a man in a cage because he did not have money. By locking him in that cage, the state absolutely guaranteed that he could not search for work, could not earn a wage, and could not possibly generate the money required to secure his release. It was an endless, terrifying loop. Men were sentenced to indefinite terms. You did not get 30 days or 60 days. You stayed incarcerated until you paid the arrears. For men whose entire industries had collapsed, this was effectively a life sentence for the crime of being economically ruined. The psychological toll this extracted from American fathers is almost impossible to quantify, but we must try to understand it to grasp the full scope of this historical tragedy. Society aggressively labeled these incarcerated men as deadbeats. The newspapers of the 1930s frequently ran editorial cartoons depicting divorced men as lazy, cigar-smoking shirkers who simply refused to support their children. The societal narrative completely ignored the macroeconomic devastation occurring outside the jailhouse walls. The stigma of failing as a provider was the ultimate shame for a man in the early 20th century. Now compound that shame with the indignity of incarceration, the loss of basic civil liberties, and the agonizing knowledge that your children are suffering in poverty while you sit helpless in a cell. Many men suffered severe mental health crises under these conditions. The historical records are peppered with tragic reports of men taking their own lives in these county jails, unable to see any mathematical or legal escape from their endless debt. To bring this into a modern perspective, imagine if a man named John in the current year 2026 faces a sudden massive collapse in the tech sector. John loses his highly paid engineering job, his stock options become worthless overnight, and algorithmic hiring filters prevent him from finding alternative work. He burns through his severance and his emergency fund. When he goes to family court to reduce his obligations, the judge points to his past tax forms and says his earning capacity remains high, refusing to lower the payments. John falls behind, is found in contempt, and his driver's license, passport, and professional licenses are automatically suspended by the state, entirely crippling his ability to ever earn a living again. While we may not use physical alimony jails in the exact same manner today, the structural mechanisms of suspending licenses and imputing phantom income are direct, unedited descendants of the aggressive enforcement tactics pioneered during the Great Depression. The potential outcomes for John in 2026 mirror the historical trends of Arthur in 1931: systemic alienation, enforced poverty, and the criminalization of financial failure. But the men locked inside the alimony clubs of the 1930s did not simply lay down and accept their fate. Human beings are incredibly resilient, and when pushed into an impossible corner by the state, they adapt, they organize, and they find loopholes. Inside those jail cells, a remarkable and entirely unexpected subculture began to form. Stripped of their livelihoods and their families, these divorced dads created highly organized, complex underground economies right under the noses of the wardens. They formed legal study groups, shared resources, and began mapping out a daring, unprecedented strategy to force the legal establishment to intervene in state-level family courts. And what they planned next would completely upend the political landscape of the era. The reality inside the walls of institutions like the Ludlow Street Jail was far removed from the mocking newspaper cartoons of the era. The men incarcerated for civil contempt did not simply languish in isolation. They actively forged a highly organized, clandestine society born out of absolute necessity. They transformed the derisively named alimony clubs into actual functioning mutual aid societies and primitive legal defense funds. You must understand that these jails were not populated by hardened criminals. The inmates were former accountants, carpenters, school teachers, and salesmen. They brought their professional administrative skills directly into their confinement. They pooled their drastically limited resources, rationing food smuggled in by sympathetic relatives to ensure the poorest among them did not starve. More importantly, they pooled their intellectual resources. They began importing law books, sharing legal precedents, and meticulously studying the specific judicial mechanics that had trapped them. To comprehend the sheer audacity of their legal strategy, we have to look closely at the constitutional loophole that allowed alimony jails to exist in the first place. The United States had federally and legally abolished debtors' prisons in the early to mid-19th century. You could not be legally incarcerated simply for owing a commercial debt to a bank or a private business. However, family court judges and state legislatures of the 1920s and 1930s utilized a breathtaking piece of semantic gymnastics to bypass this constitutional protection. They legally defined alimony and child support not as a standard commercial debt, but as an equitable, moral, and societal duty mandated by the highest authority of the court. Therefore, when a completely broke, unemployed father failed to pay, he was not defaulting on a debt. He was committing an intentional affront to the dignity and authority of the judge. This classification of civil contempt was the magic key that kept the jail cells locked. The men inside realized that their only path to freedom was to legally attack this classification, to prove that punishing an inability to pay was fundamentally different from punishing a refusal to pay. This realization birthed the formation of underground advocacy groups, most notably the early iterations of what would become the Alimony Payers Protective Association. Operating from within the jail walls and heavily supported by the few members who had managed to secure release, this association began drafting highly technical legal petitions. They handwrote hundreds of letters, carefully documenting the exact financial mathematics of their ruin. They detailed how their pre-depression salaries of $3,000 had vanished, how their current bank balances sat at zero, and how the state was spending taxpayer money to house them in a cell, rather than allowing them to contribute to the economic recovery. They systematically mailed these dossiers to state legislators, appellate judges, and critically, to the editors of major metropolitan newspapers. In some jurisdictions, the sheer overcrowding of these facilities forced wardens into a bizarre, dystopian compromise that these early associations immediately exploited. Some jails instituted a shadow system of day passes. A man incarcerated for civil contempt might be allowed to leave the prison gates at dawn, strictly for the purpose of seeking manual labor in the decimated city streets. He might spend 14 hours standing on a freezing dock hoping to load cargo, or walking miles to sell apples for pennies, only to be required, under threat of severe criminal penalties, to report back to his jail cell by sundown. If he managed to earn 50 cents for a day of grueling labor, the court required him to hand over 40 cents to his arrears, leaving him a dime for his own survival before being locked back in his cage. It was a state-sanctioned form of indentured servitude, but these day passes also allowed the inmates to act as couriers, physically delivering their legal petitions to the courthouses and press rooms, entirely bypassing the jail censors. Imagine if a man named David in the year 2026 finds himself trapped in a similar regulatory nightmare. David drives for a heavily algorithmic rideshare network and delivers groceries through an app to make ends meet. A sudden massive shift in the platform's artificial intelligence routing drastically cuts his earning power by 80% practically overnight. He has no union, no safety net, and no way to appeal to the algorithm. When he falls behind on his legally mandated family support payments, the state automatic enforcement system immediately suspends his driver's license. Without a license, he cannot drive for the apps. Without the apps, he cannot earn money. Without money, he cannot get his license back. He is trapped in a completely digitized version of the Ludlow Street Jail, a modern-day debtor's prison constructed of revoked credentials and automated penalties. Just as the men in 1932 had to coordinate massive organized resistance against the rigid classification of civil contempt, David and others in 2026 would have to organize to fundamentally change how the law interprets algorithmic income and automated state penalties during periods of extreme economic volatility. The historical trends remain perfectly mirrored. Slowly, the relentless letter-writing campaign and the sheer, undeniable reality of the macroeconomic depression began to crack the media narrative. Newspaper editors, initially hostile to these men, started to recognize the profound human tragedy unfolding in the county lockups. They began sending investigative reporters to interview the inmates of the alimony clubs. The public was suddenly confronted with front-page stories detailing the absurdity of the system. Readers read harrowing accounts of World War I veterans, men who had survived the trenches of Europe, now rotting in domestic jails simply because the factories that employed them had collapsed. The societal perception began a slow, agonizing pivot. The narrative shifted from condemning deadbeat fathers to questioning a draconian legal apparatus that seemed entirely disconnected from the reality of the Great Depression. This hard-won shift in public sympathy was the exact leverage the Alimony Payers Protective Association needed to push their agenda out of the jails and onto the floors of the state legislatures. Draft bills began appearing in places like Albany, New York, and Springfield, Illinois, proposing radical concepts for the time. These bills suggested granting judges the discretionary power to temporarily suspend alimony payments during periods of documented, involuntary unemployment. They proposed capping the maximum length of time a man could be held in civil contempt for a single debt. The inmates had successfully transformed their desperate, localized survival strategy into a legitimate, formidable legislative movement that threatened to rewrite the deeply entrenched rules of family law. They had pushed the issue to the absolute brink, forcing politicians to publicly choose between maintaining the rigid, traditional mechanisms of the court or acknowledging the unprecedented economic devastation of the American citizen. But just as these desperate fathers believed they were on the verge of a monumental legal breakthrough that would finally empty the alimony jails, they hit an immovable wall. Altering the fundamental structure of alimony and child support meant disrupting the only fragile financial lifeline available to millions of legally dependent, deeply impoverished women and children who were also fighting for survival in the exact same destroyed economy. The legal pushback was immediate, incredibly well organized, and politically explosive. The stage was set for one of the most intense, desperate, and morally complex legislative battles of the entire decade. The pushback was not born out of malice, but out of an equally desperate, terrifying calculus of survival. To understand the fierce opposition to the Fathers' legislative reform efforts, we must examine the precarious position of divorced women during the Great Depression. The state legislatures and family court judges were not merely acting as punitive moralists. They were functioning as the ultimate financial gatekeepers of a society teetering on the edge of total collapse. If a judge legally absolved a father of his alimony and child support obligations, that financial burden did not simply vanish into the ether. It fell squarely onto the shoulders of the former wives, and by immediate extension, onto the already bankrupted local municipalities. During the early 1930s, the modern American welfare state did not yet exist. There was no widespread federal safety net, no food stamps, and no universal housing assistance. The burden of public relief fell entirely on local charities, churches, and city governments, all of which were completely exhausted by 1932. The alimony decree was literally the final, razor-thin barrier standing between thousands of divorced women and absolute starvation. Furthermore, the societal and economic landscape for women in the workforce during this era was exceptionally hostile. As the Depression deepened, a massive cultural backlash emerged against women holding jobs. The prevailing sentiment, eventually codified in federal policies like Section 213 of the Economy Act of 1932, dictated that scarce jobs must be reserved for male breadwinners. Employers routinely fired female employees, particularly married or divorced women, under the assumption that they should be supported by a man. Consider a historical case study representing the other side of this devastating coin. We will look at Margaret, a divorced mother of 3 living in a cramped tenement in Brooklyn in 1932. Her former husband is currently incarcerated in the Ludlow Street Jail for civil contempt after his manufacturing business went under. Margaret is completely isolated. She cannot secure legitimate employment because factories and department stores are actively rejecting female applicants. Her local parish has run out of coal and flour to distribute. When she hears that the Alimony Payers Protective Association is lobbying Albany to legally suspend her husband's arrears, Margaret and her legal advocates view this not as judicial reform, but as an absolute death sentence. If the court suspends that payment, even temporarily, Margaret will be evicted onto the frozen streets within the month. Her lawyers fiercely argue before the appellate judges that the state cannot legally prioritize the freedom of the father over the basic biological survival of his dependent children. This created a zero-sum game of absolute misery. The state was forced to choose who would bear the brunt of the macroeconomic collapse: the unemployed father locked in a cell, or the unemployable mother and children cast out into the Hoovervilles. The legal establishment heavily favored protecting the mother, not necessarily out of feminist sympathy, but out of sheer terror of municipal bankruptcy. Politicians knew that if they emptied the alimony jails, they would instantly flood the overwhelmed city shelters and orphanages with destitute dependents. Consequently, the legal defense of the status quo became incredibly aggressive. Judges leaned heavily on the principle of contract sanctity. They argued that a divorce decree was an inviolable contract entered into before the state. To retroactively modify that contract simply because the national economy had faltered was viewed as a dangerous, radical precedent. Conservative jurists warned that if family courts began breaking alimony contracts due to economic hardship, the contagion would spread. Citizens might start demanding the cancellation of mortgage contracts, commercial leases, and municipal bonds. The very foundation of American contract law was perceived to be at stake. To frame this within a modern context, imagine a scenario in the year 2026. A massive unforeseen economic shock causes hyperinflation in the housing and grocery markets, while simultaneously triggering widespread algorithmic layoffs in the service sectors. We have a citizen named Michael whose digital gig income has been completely zeroed out by a sudden platform update, leaving him unable to pay his court-ordered child support. On the other side is his former spouse, Emily, who relies entirely on that exact payment to cover a drastically inflated, algorithmically priced monthly rent that she can barely afford. If Michael petitions the court in 2026 for a complete suspension of his payments due to involuntary technological unemployment, Emily faces instant, catastrophic eviction. The state welfare systems are hopelessly gridlocked by the sudden surge in applicants. Just as in 1932, the modern court is trapped in an impossible dilemma. Granting leniency to the financially ruined father guarantees the immediate financial destruction of the mother and children. The historical trends show us that in these moments of acute crisis, the judicial system instinctively hardens its rules, defaulting to rigid enforcement in a desperate attempt to stave off widespread social dependency. This fierce, localized battle over resources culminated on the floors of state assemblies across the country. In New York, the debates over modifying the civil contempt laws were vicious. Lobbyists for the fathers argued passionately about civil liberties, constitutional overreach, and the illogical cruelty of debtors' prisons. Conversely, advocates for dependent families pointed to the overflowing breadlines and warned of a catastrophic wave of child abandonment. Every proposed legislative compromise died in committee, paralyzed by the sheer mathematical impossibility of the situation. There simply was not enough money in the economy to satisfy the legal obligations of the past. The men organizing inside the alimony jails and their advocates on the outside watched, as their meticulously drafted bills were repeatedly struck down by panicked politicians. The realization set in that appealing to the logical empathy of the state legislature was a failed strategy. The system would never willingly bend as long as the immediate financial threat of supporting destitute families hung over the government's head. The fathers recognized that playing by the established rules of lobbying and legal petition was useless against a state apparatus terrified of its own insolvency. They needed a catalyst, something so disruptive and undeniable that it would bypass the state courts entirely. The localized fight was over. It was time to force a national crisis of conscience. They began laying the groundwork for a highly coordinated, incredibly risky legal maneuver designed to strike at the very heart of the judicial system, a move that would pit the constitutional rights of the individual directly against the survival instincts of the American government. The localized fights in state assemblies had proven completely futile, revealing a stark reality to the incarcerated fathers. They recognized that state politicians and local judges were hopelessly paralyzed by the immediate, terrifying threat of municipal bankruptcy and overflowing breadlines. To expect a local family court judge to voluntarily dismantle the only financial enforcement mechanism, keeping destitute dependents off the city ledger, was a strategic dead end. Therefore, the leaders of the underground alimony associations orchestrated a massive, unprecedented pivot. If the state courts were compromised by their own survival instincts, the fathers would bypass the state jurisdiction entirely and elevate their plight to the federal level. They decided to weaponize the United States Constitution against the state-level family court system. Their primary mechanism for this escalation was one of the oldest and most powerful legal maneuvers in Western jurisprudence, the writ of habeas corpus. Historically utilized to demand that a prisoner be brought before a court to determine if their detention is lawful, this writ became the central instrument of their rebellion. The men inside the Ludlow Street Jail and similar facilities across the country began drafting hundreds of standardized, highly technical federal habeas corpus petitions. They were no longer arguing about the fairness of their alimony calculations or pleading for temporary leniency due to the Depression. They fundamentally changed the legal battlefield. They argued that their incarceration was a direct, blatant violation of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which strictly prohibits involuntary servitude and peonage, as well as a violation of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process and equal protection under the law. To understand the sheer brilliance and the explosive nature of this legal theory, we must examine the specific conditions these men were enduring. Consider a historical case study of a man named Thomas, a former commercial real estate broker from New Jersey whose business evaporated in 1930. Thomas is incarcerated in a county facility for $3,000 in civil contempt arrears. Because the jail is overcrowded, he is forced into a shadow system of labor. He is granted a daily release strictly to perform grueling physical labor at the docks, earning meager Depression-era wages. The state family court mandates that almost the entirety of his daily wage be seized and applied to his arrears, leaving him with literally pennies for food before he must return to his cell at nightfall or face severe criminal prosecution. In his federal petition, Thomas meticulously documented this arrangement. He argued before the federal district court that he was not merely paying a debt. He was an indentured servant of the state. He asserted that the state of New Jersey had effectively resurrected a system of peonage, utilizing the threat of indefinite physical cagement to extract forced labor, thereby violating his absolute federal constitutional rights. Filing these federal petitions from inside a county lockup in 1932 was an incredibly complex logistical nightmare. Inmates had extremely limited access to paper, legal texts, or postage. Documents had to be meticulously handwritten, often drafted collectively by the prison legal study groups by the dim light of the cell blocks. They were then smuggled out of the facilities during visiting hours or handed off during those grueling day labor passes to sympathetic family members or the few external attorneys willing to work pro bono for the association. When these federal subpoenas suddenly began landing on the desks of local county sheriffs and state court judges, commanding them to appear in federal court to justify the detention of these men, it sent shockwaves through the local legal establishments. The state authorities were utterly infuriated. They viewed this as a rogue, illegitimate attack on state sovereignty. This strategy forced the federal judiciary into an incredibly uncomfortable and historically significant standoff. There is a long-standing, deeply entrenched legal doctrine known as the domestic relations exception. For over a century, federal courts have traditionally and forcefully declined to intervene in matters of state family law, including divorce, alimony, and child custody, maintaining that these are strictly the domain of state governments. However, the sheer volume of these habeas corpus petitions, coupled with the undeniable macroeconomic devastation of the Great Depression, created a profound crisis of jurisdiction. The federal judges were looking at cases where American citizens were being held indefinitely without trial, without a jury, and without the ability to secure public defense, all under conditions that strongly resembled unconstitutional debtors' prisons. If a federal judge ruled in favor of Thomas and declared the state civil contempt mechanism unconstitutional, it would instantaneously wipe out the enforcement mechanism for every family court in the United States overnight, plunging the entire system into absolute chaos. Let us bring this complex jurisdictional clash into a modern perspective to understand the potential outcomes of such legal friction today. Imagine a scenario in the current year 2026. A man named Robert operates entirely within the modern digital economy, earning his living through decentralized finance platforms and independent digital contracting. A severe, unforeseen global regulatory crackdown instantly freezes his sector of the digital economy, zeroing out his income stream. Concurrently, his state child support enforcement agency, utilizing automated algorithmic tracking, instantly triggers a complete freeze on Robert's digital wallets, suspends his digital identity credentials required for freelance portals, and revokes his state-issued licenses. Robert is algorithmically excommunicated from the economy. Bypassing the overwhelmed state family courts, Robert files a massive federal civil rights lawsuit. He argues that the state automated enforcement software has executed an illegal seizure of his digital assets and entirely deprived him of his fundamental liberty to participate in the economy without federal due process. Just as Thomas in 1932 pitted his physical body and the 13th Amendment against state family law, Robert in 2026 pits his digital identity and federal civil rights against automated state enforcement. The historical trends demonstrate that extreme economic pressure inevitably forces the collision of state family regulations and overarching federal constitutional protections. Back in the federal courthouses of the 1930s, the initial response from the federal bench was one of intense hesitation. Many federal judges, relying heavily on the domestic relations exception, desperately attempted to dismiss the habeas corpus petitions on procedural grounds, telling the men they had to exhaust all their appeals within the very state courts that had imprisoned them. The federal system was attempting to wash its hands of the crisis. The leaders of the Alimony Payers Protective Association, watching their meticulously crafted legal strategy stall in federal procedural delays, realized that brilliant paperwork was no longer sufficient. Relying on constitutional logic was failing against a judicial system that was terrified of setting a precedent that could collapse local economies. They understood that to force the hand of the federal government or to compel the Supreme Court to finally intervene, they needed to generate a public spectacle so undeniably severe that ignoring it would become politically and morally impossible. The legal debate had reached its absolute limit. It was time to physically disrupt the daily operation of the jails themselves, initiating a coordinated, high-stakes action from within the cell blocks that would test the very limits of human endurance and potentially cost some of these desperate fathers their lives. The frustration boiling over within the alimony clubs reached its flashpoint in the winter of 1932. The incarcerated fathers realized that while their federal petitions were technically sound, the wheels of justice moved at a pace the starving human body could not afford. They shifted from a strategy of legal paper fighting to one of physical, passive resistance. This was the birth of the Great Alimony Hunger Strikes. Across multiple facilities, most notably in New Jersey and New York, men who had previously been model prisoners suddenly refused their meager daily rations. They were no longer willing to be the invisible collateral damage of a broken economy. By refusing to eat, they forced the state to acknowledge a terrifying reality. The government was now physically responsible for the life or death of thousands of men who had committed no crime other than being poor. To understand the strategic depth of this move, consider the historical case study of a man named George, a former industrial architect held in the Newark City jail. George was not a radical or a career protester. He was a man who, 3 years prior, had been designing the very skylines that now stood as empty monuments to a dead economy. When George and 42 other inmates began their strike, they released a collective manifesto to the local press. They didn't just ask for food. They demanded a legislative moratorium on all alimony payments for the duration of the national emergency. They argued that if the federal government could declare a bank holiday to save the financial institutions, the state could surely declare a domestic holiday to save the American father. The state's response was a brutal exercise in institutional panic. Wardens, terrified that a death in custody would spark a citywide riot among the already restless unemployed masses, attempted to break the strike through isolation. George and the leaders were moved to solitary confinement, but the message had already bypassed the bars. Groups like the Alimony Payers Protective Association organized picket lines outside the jail gates. These weren't just men. They were the mothers, sisters, and even some of the adult children of the incarcerated fathers. They carried signs that read, "My father is not a criminal, he is unemployed." This created a visual spectacle that the sensationalist newsreels of the 1930s devoured. For the first time, the American public saw these men not as deadbeats, but as gaunt, skeletal victims of a system that had lost its moral compass. While the strike raged inside the jails, a massive, uncoordinated demographic shift was happening across the American landscape that the government was powerless to stop. This is what historians call the Great Desertion. For every man who was caught and jailed in an alimony club, an estimated 10 others chose a different path. They became hobos. They abandoned their identities, hopped on freight trains, and vanished into the vast interior of the United States. This was not an act of malice, but a desperate survival mechanism against a legal system that refused to acknowledge the economic apocalypse. If you remained in your home city, you were a target for the sheriff. If you became a nameless traveler in a California work camp or a Midwestern harvest crew, you were a ghost. Imagine a scenario in 2026 that mirrors this historical trend. Imagine a man named Mark, an independent contractor in the gig economy. Mark is hit with a court-ordered support payment based on his 2024 earnings, but in 2026, his niche has been entirely replaced by generative artificial intelligence. He has no assets, no savings, and the state has already frozen his bank accounts and flagged his social security number for wage garnishment. Mark realizes that any traditional job he takes will result in an immediate 70% seizure of his wages, leaving him unable to pay rent or eat. Faced with the threat of modern-day civil contempt, Mark chooses the 2026 version of the hobo lifestyle. He deletes his digital footprint, moves into a cash-only van life existence, and works under-the-table manual labor jobs, entirely exiting the formal economy. Just as the deserting fathers of 1932 created a massive loss in tax revenue and societal stability, the digital deserters of 2026 represent a potential outcome of a legal system that prioritizes rigid enforcement over economic reality. The sheer volume of these desertions during the Great Depression began to have an unintended but profound effect on the very people the alimony laws were designed to protect. When a father vanished into the hobo jungles, the flow of money stopped completely and permanently. There was no one to jail, no wages to garnish, and no assets to seize. The state realized that an incarcerated father produced $0, and a deserted father produced $0, but a father with a modified, manageable payment plan might at least produce something. This realization began to shift the internal logic of the judiciary. The absolute, unyielding stance of the 1920s was being eroded by the cold, hard math of the 1930s. In 1933, the pressure finally reached the highest levels of state government. In New York, Governor Herbert Lehman was forced to confront the reality of the alimony jails. The hunger strikes had lasted weeks, and several men were in critical condition. The press was relentless. Lehman, a reform-minded politician, realized that the current system was a revolving door of misery that benefited no one. He initiated a series of emergency executive inquiries into the county lockups. What his investigators found was a system of absolute chaos. They documented cases of men held for years over debts as small as $50. Debts that had ballooned into thousands due to interest and legal fees that the men could never hope to pay. This led to the introduction of the first major legislative breakthrough, the Ferrin-Buckley Bill. This was a revolutionary piece of legislation for its time. It proposed that no man could be imprisoned for alimony contempt if he could prove to the court that he was legitimately, involuntarily unemployed. It shifted the burden of proof, but it offered a legal exit ramp that had previously been welded shut. The bill sparked a firestorm of debate. Opponents claimed it was a deadbeats charter that would lead to the total abandonment of American women. Supporters argued it was a necessary act of mercy to prevent a full-scale collapse of the rule of law. But as the bill moved toward a vote, a new and unexpected obstacle emerged. The very women's groups that had been fighting for survival realized that if the alimony jails were emptied, the state would have to find another way to support the millions of dependents left behind. They began to demand that if the state was going to release the fathers from their financial obligations, the state itself must step in to fulfill the role of the provider. This demand laid the groundwork for the most significant transformation in the history of the American family, the birth of the federal welfare state. The plight of the divorced dad was about to become the catalyst for a radical reimagining of the relationship between the citizen, the family, and the United States government. But before that could happen, one final massive legal battle had to be fought in the highest court in the land, a battle that would determine if a man's right to liberty could ever be truly separated from his ability to pay a debt. The stage was being set for a Supreme Court showdown that would redefine the 13th Amendment for the modern age. The path to the Supreme Court of the United States was paved with the shattered lives of men who had become unwilling test subjects for a legal theory that seemed to defy the very spirit of the American Bill of Rights. As the hunger strikes paralyzed the local jail systems and the Great Desertion drained the tax bases of major industrial hubs, the legal teams behind the Alimony Payers Protective Association realized that legislative reform, while helpful, was a fickle and localized solution. They needed a definitive federal ruling that would once and for all categorize the incarceration of indigent divorced fathers as a violation of the 13th Amendment's prohibition against involuntary servitude. To do this, they selected a flagship case that would force the highest court in the land to look directly into the eyes of the Great Depression. The case study that began this ascent centered on a man we will call William, a former high-ranking clerk for a collapsed brokerage firm in Manhattan. William's story was the perfect embodiment of the era's cruelty. In 1929, he had been ordered to pay a monthly sum that represented nearly half of his substantial income. By 1933, William was living in a Hooverville, sleeping on a mattress made of old newspapers, and surviving on the occasional bowl of watery soup provided by a local mission. He had paid every cent he owned until his bank account was literally zero. When the state court ordered his arrest for failing to produce the next $50, William's attorneys argued that the state was attempting to squeeze blood from a stone. They contended that by threatening him with indefinite imprisonment, unless he performed labor to pay a private debt, the state of New York had created a system of peonage that mirrored the dark days of the post-Reconstruction South. This was a high-stakes legal gamble. If the Supreme Court agreed with William, they would be effectively declaring that no state in the Union could ever again use the threat of jail to enforce family support orders against the poor. The potential outcomes were staggering. It would mean that child support and alimony would be treated like any other civil debt, such as a credit line or a car loan, where the creditor cannot put the debtor in a cage. But the counter-argument from the state's attorneys was equally powerful and rooted in the survival of the social order. They argued that the 13th Amendment was intended to abolish chattel slavery, not to prevent the state from enforcing the sacred moral obligations of a father to his children. They maintained that if the court ruled in favor of William, it would signal the total collapse of the American family unit, as men would feel legally empowered to abandon their financial duties without fear of consequence. While the legal minds argued in the hallowed halls of Washington, D.C., the reality on the ground in 1933 was shifting in a way that would fundamentally alter the outcome of this struggle. This was the year of the New Deal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had taken office, and the federal government was beginning to flex its muscles in ways previously unimaginable in American history. The New Deal introduced a concept that would inadvertently provide the family courts with an escape hatch from their own cruelty: the social safety net. With the introduction of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and eventually the Social Security Act of 1935, specifically the Aid to Dependent Children program, the government began to take over the financial role that the incarcerated fathers were physically unable to fulfill. Imagine if a man named Steve in the current year 2026 finds himself in a similar structural transition. Steve is a traditional tradesman whose work has been marginalized by the rapid adoption of automated modular construction. He is drowning in arrears, and his state's family court is threatening him with a modern version of contempt. However, the federal government in 2026 has just initiated a Universal Basic Income pilot program, or a massive federal jobs guarantee for displaced workers. The court, seeing that Steve now has a guaranteed, non-garnishable baseline of support provided by the state, suddenly has a new variable. The state can now step in to ensure the children are fed while Steve is given a technological retraining grace period. The pressure on the individual father to perform the impossible is diverted to a federal system. This historical trend of the state stepping in as the provider of last resort began exactly in 1933, as a direct response to the failure of the alimony jail system. Back in 1933, as the Supreme Court weighed the merits of William's case, the federal government's new relief programs began to act as a pressure valve. As federal money started flowing into the states to support destitute mothers and children, the absolute necessity of keeping men in alimony jails began to evaporate. The judges who had previously been terrified of municipal bankruptcy now had a federal check to rely on. Consequently, the judiciary began to quietly move toward a middle ground. Instead of the Supreme Court issuing a radical, sweeping ruling that might have crippled state power forever, they watched as state legislatures, sensing the changing winds, began to pass their own reforms to avoid federal intervention. This led to the widespread adoption of what we now call the ability to pay standard. It seems like common sense today, but in 1933 it was a hard-won victory for the divorced dad. This standard mandated that before a man could be held in contempt and jailed, the court must perform an exhaustive, evidence-based inquiry into his actual, current financial assets and earning capacity. The era of the court simply assuming a man could find work in a dead economy was coming to a close. The legal system was being forced to acknowledge that a man's right to liberty was, in fact, protected by the Constitution, even in the context of family law. However, this transition was far from smooth. As the state began to take over the role of the provider through early welfare programs, it also began to demand something in exchange. The government realized that if it was going to pay to support the children of divorced or deserted fathers, it wanted its money back. This was the birth of the state as a debt collector. The struggle was no longer just between a man and his former spouse. It was now a battle between a man and the United States government. The alimony jails might have been slowly emptying, but a new, even more pervasive system of surveillance and financial tracking was being constructed to replace them. The divorced dad of the late 1930s was moving out of the physical cage and into a financial net that would prove to be even harder to escape. This shift created a brand new set of problems. As the government became the primary stakeholder in child support, the rules of the game changed again. The state started to view the father's debt as a debt to the public treasury. This meant that even if a mother wanted to forgive the debt or work out a private arrangement, the state could refuse, insisting on full repayment to offset the cost of public relief. The divorced fathers of the Great Depression had successfully fought for their physical freedom, but they had inadvertently invited the most powerful entity on earth, the federal government, to become their permanent, unyielding creditor. But as the 1930s drew to a close and the world began to pivot toward a new, even larger crisis, these men found themselves at a strange crossroads. The same government that had been hunting them for pennies was about to undergo a massive transformation that would require their strength, their labor, and their lives in a completely different theater of conflict. The industrial machinery that had remained silent for a decade was beginning to hum with the dark energy of an approaching world war. The divorced dad, once an outcast in the alimony jail, was about to be rebranded as a vital cog in the American war machine. But would this new role finally bring them the legal equity they had been fighting for, or would it simply be another form of state-mandated service? The answer would lie in the radical changes to tax law and military pay that were about to be implemented, changing the face of fatherhood and the law forever. As the 1930s drew to a close, the industrial gears of the United States began to turn with a newfound frantic energy. The looming threat of global conflict in Europe and the Pacific achieved what years of legislative debate could not: the total mobilization of the American male workforce. For the divorced father, this transition represented a profound and complicated shift in his legal status. The state, which had spent a decade hunting him for arrears and locking him in alimony jails, suddenly viewed him as an indispensable asset for national defense. This period saw the birth of a revolutionary administrative mechanism that would permanently solve the state's problem of collection, while fundamentally altering the financial autonomy of the individual, the precursor to the modern wage garnishment system and the Class F allotment. To understand how this radical change functioned, we must look at the historical trends of the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. This was the first peacetime draft in United States history. It created a massive logistical challenge for the family courts. Hundreds of thousands of men with outstanding alimony and child support orders were being inducted into the military. Once a man entered the Army or Navy, he was no longer under the immediate jurisdiction of a local county sheriff. The state courts realized they could not easily jail a soldier for civil contempt without severely sabotaging the war effort. To prevent a total collapse of support payments, the federal government stepped in with the Servicemen's Dependents Allowance Act. Imagine a case study involving a man named Henry, a divorced father from Ohio who had been struggling to find steady work since 1934. Henry is drafted in 1941. Under the new federal rules, the government did not wait for Henry to write a check to his former spouse. Instead, the military implemented a mandatory deduction directly from his monthly pay. This was the Class F allotment. The government took a fixed portion of Henry's soldier pay, typically $22, and added a federal contribution to it, sending the total directly to his dependents. For the first time in American history, the payment was automated, centralized, and federally managed. For Henry, this meant he was finally free from the threat of the alimony jail, as his obligations were being met at the source. However, it also meant he had effectively lost all control over his own earnings. The state had become the silent, permanent middleman in his financial life. This shift provides a direct historical lineage to the potential outcomes we see in the year 2026. Imagine a man named Alex in 2026, a freelance digital asset designer. Alex operates in a world where the traditional paycheck has been replaced by real-time micropayments streamed through a decentralized ledger. To ensure child support compliance in this high-velocity economy, the state implements an automated smart contract layer that sits on top of all legal financial transactions. The moment Alex receives a payment for a digital design, a pre-calculated percentage is instantly diverted to a state-controlled escrow account before Alex ever sees the balance in his personal wallet. Just as the Class F allotment of 1942 bypassed the soldier's agency to ensure the state's social stability, the automated ledger protocols of 2026 represent the ultimate evolution of this trend. The divorced father is no longer chased for money. The money is simply intercepted at the point of creation. This wartime stabilization had a paradoxical effect on the social standing of the divorced dad. Because the federal government was now facilitating the payments and the men were wearing the uniform of the United States, the toxic deadbeat stigma began to soften. A man could be a divorced father and a hero at the same time. This was a massive psychological shift from the dark days of 1932. However, this new social acceptance came with a steep price. The federal government, having tasted the efficiency of centralized payment distribution, was not interested in returning to the chaotic, localized system of the past once the war ended. The temporary wartime measures began to harden into permanent domestic policy. We must also examine the radical changes in tax law that occurred during this era. Prior to the early 1940s, only a small fraction of Americans paid federal income tax. To fund the war, the government introduced the Revenue Act of 1942, which transformed the income tax into a mass tax and introduced the concept of employer withholding. This was a turning point for the divorced father. The government now had a direct line into every legitimate workplace in the country. They had the records, they had the addresses, and they had the mechanism to subtract funds before a worker ever touched his lamplit kitchen table. The infrastructure of the modern Child Support Enforcement Agency was essentially built on the bones of the World War II tax machine. But as the men returned from the front lines in 1945 and 1946, they found a legal landscape that had been fundamentally reshaped while they were away. The Great Depression had broken the old world, and the war had built a new one. The family courts, now backed by the data-gathering power of the Internal Revenue Service and the precedent of military allotments, were more powerful than ever. The men who had fought for freedom abroad returned to find that their domestic lives were now under a level of state surveillance that would have been unimaginable to their own fathers. The battle for the divorced dad was shifting from a fight against physical incarceration to a fight against a sophisticated, bureaucratic ledger that never slept and never forgot a balance. This led to a new form of legal friction. As the 1940s transitioned into the early 1950s, the focus shifted toward the concept of the skip tracer. The government began to use its vast new databases to track men who moved across state lines to avoid their obligations. The era of the hobo jungle was over. The era of the federal fugitive had begun. This was the inception of the Uniform Reciprocal Enforcement of Support Act, which allowed states to cooperate and enforce orders across borders. The net was closing, and the divorced father was becoming the most tracked demographic in the United States. Yet, within this tightening net, a new spark of resistance was beginning to flicker. The men who had survived the foxholes of Europe and the Pacific were not the same men who had sat broken and defeated in the Ludlow Street jail in 1932. They had returned with a different sense of their own rights and a much lower tolerance for perceived injustice. They began to question why, if the state could be so efficient at collecting their money, it was so notoriously inefficient at protecting their right to see their children. The focus was about to shift from the wallet to the heart. The divorced dads of the post-war era were preparing to launch a new kind of movement, one that would move beyond financial survival and strike at the very core of the custody system itself. But as they prepared to challenge the tender years doctrine once again, they would find that the legal establishment had a final devastating weapon waiting for them in the shadows of the burgeoning Cold War. The legal establishment of the late 1940s and early 1950s was not merely a collection of judges and attorneys. It was the ideological gatekeeper of the American post-war dream. As veterans returned and the Cold War began to cast a long, paranoid shadow over domestic life, the stable nuclear family was no longer just a social preference. It was a national security priority. For the divorced father, this meant that the relative leniency and social capital he had earned while wearing a uniform were rapidly being rescinded. The state began to view any disruption to the traditional family structure as a potential vulnerability, a crack in the armor of American exceptionalism that could be exploited by foreign ideologies. The weapon the legal system utilized to suppress the growing dissent of fathers was the weapon of psychological pathologization. Throughout the Great Depression, a man who failed to pay was a deadbeat or a victim of the economy. But in the 1950s, a divorced man who fought for custody or challenged the tender years doctrine was increasingly labeled as mentally unstable or morally deviant. The burgeoning field of forensic psychology began to enter the courtroom with unprecedented authority. Judges who previously relied on religious morality or simple financial math now deferred to experts who claimed the father's desire for primary custody was a sign of a pathological obsession that would cause irreparable developmental harm to the child. This was a sophisticated, academic evolution of the old tender years doctrine. It wasn't just that mothers were naturally better. It was that fathers who disagreed were scientifically proven to be a threat. Imagine a case study involving a man named Richard, a former radar technician in the Pacific Theater, now living in suburban New Jersey in 1952. Richard is divorced and has been dutifully paying his automated support through the new withholding systems. However, he is being denied all visitation because his former spouse claims his presence is disruptive to the child's domestic tranquility. When Richard goes to court to demand a fixed visitation schedule, the state appoints a court psychologist. This expert, influenced by the prevailing theories of the era, testifies that Richard's insistence on seeing his child more than once a month is a symptom of a refusal to accept the termination of the marital unit. The court utilizes this testimony to further restrict Richard's rights, effectively telling him that his only valid role in the child's life is that of a distant, silent financier. Richard is not in a physical alimony jail, but he is trapped in a psychological cage where his very love for his children is used as evidence against his fitness as a parent. This era saw the maturation of the state as a secondary parent. As the federal government's role in the economy grew through the GI Bill and massive infrastructure projects, its involvement in family surveillance grew in lockstep. The 1950s introduced the concept of the social worker as a domestic investigator. These state agents had the authority to enter homes, interview neighbors, and scrutinize the private lives of divorced fathers to ensure they were maintaining the moral standards required by the court. If a father was found to be living a lifestyle that deviated from the strict, conservative norms of the era, his already limited visitation could be revoked instantly. This created a culture of deep, persistent fear among divorced men, who realized that any attempt to live an authentic life could be used by the state to sever their remaining parental bonds. To see the potential outcomes of this trend in our own era, consider a scenario in the year 2026. A man named Brian is navigating a high-conflict divorce. In 2026, the court no longer relies solely on human social workers. Instead, it utilizes sentiment analysis algorithms and social media scraping to determine a parent's psychological stability. The state's AI monitors Brian's digital communications, his purchasing habits, and even his physiological data from wearable devices to create a real-time stability score. If Brian's score dips due to the natural stress of the legal battle, the algorithm automatically triggers a recommendation for supervised visitation. Just as Richard in 1952 was judged by the subjective theories of a court psychologist, Brian in 2026 is judged by the opaque logic of a machine learning model. The historical trends show that the state always seeks to justify its intervention through the lens of the latest available science, regardless of how biased that science might eventually prove to be. The intense pressure of the 1950s eventually led to a tipping point. The men who had been silenced by the psychological weaponization of the law began to find each other in the new, sprawling suburbs of the United States. They began to realize that their individual tragedies were actually a systemic, national phenomenon. This realization birthed the first organized, non-clandestine fathers' rights organizations. Unlike the Alimony Payers Protective Association of the 1930s, which was born in a jail cell and focused on financial survival, these new groups were focused on the concept of constitutional equality in parenting. They began to challenge the very definition of the best interests of the child, arguing that it was in a child's best interest to have a meaningful relationship with both parents, regardless of the marital status. They faced an uphill battle that was steeper than anything their predecessors in the Great Depression had experienced. They were fighting against a culture that was obsessed with stability and conformity. To challenge the family court was to challenge the American way of life itself. But these men had a secret advantage. The very technology the state had built to track them was also allowing them to communicate and organize on a scale that was previously impossible. They began to utilize the growing power of the television and the national magazine to tell their side of the story. They started to show the public the empty chairs at the dinner table and the letters from fathers that were never delivered to their children. This was the beginning of a long, slow cultural thaw. The rigid, binary view of the 1950s family was starting to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. The legal system, sensing that its psychological arguments were starting to lose their potency, began to look for a new way to maintain control. It found that answer in the most unexpected of places, the burgeoning civil rights movements of the 1960s. The courts realized that if they could not maintain the old order through psychology, they would have to do it through a radical restructuring of the legal code itself. The divorced dads of the early 1960s were standing on the threshold of a revolution that would change everything. The no-fault divorce movement was about to sweep the nation, promising to end the bitter, high-stakes battles of the past. But as the fathers would soon learn, This new era of legal freedom would come with its own set of hidden traps and unintended consequences. The battle for the heart and the wallet was about to enter its most complex phase yet. The question was no longer how the state would punish the father, but how it would define him in a world where the old rules no longer applied. As we prepare for the final part of this masterclass, we will look at how the legacy of the Great Depression fathers paved the way for the modern landscape of family law, and why the lessons they learned in the alimony jails are more relevant in 2026 than they have ever been before. The transition from the 1950s to the 1960s was not just a change in decades, it was a fundamental shift in the American soul. The culmination of this century-long odyssey brings us to a chilling realization. The struggles of the 1930s were not merely a localized glitch in the American timeline, but the blueprints for the modern administrative state. As we stand in 2026, the physical walls of the Ludlow Street Jail have been replaced by the digital parameters of the global financial network. To understand the legacy of the Great Depression fathers, we must examine the final, most transformative shift in the legal landscape: the transition from punitive incarceration to the totalized monetization of the parent-child relationship. By the mid-1960s, the legal system realized that the heavy-handed, overtly cruel tactics of the alimony jails were a PR nightmare for a nation trying to promote itself as the leader of the free world. The response was the introduction of no-fault divorce. While marketed as a liberation movement to reduce conflict, the historical trends show that it actually expanded the state's role as the ultimate arbiter of the family. Since anyone could now leave a marriage for any reason, the volume of cases skyrocketed. The state responded not by relaxing its grip, but by automating its enforcement. The struggle for the father moved from proving his innocence in a jail cell to navigating the Title IV systems of the Social Security Act, which provided federal incentives for states to maximize child support collection. Consider a final case study that bridges the gap between the past and our present. We will look at a man named Kevin in 1975. Kevin is part of the first generation to live under the modernized enforcement era. Unlike the fathers of 1932, Kevin doesn't have to worry about a sheriff physically locking him up for a few months of arrears, at least not initially. Instead, Kevin finds that the state has already notified his employer to deduct funds from his check before he even sees them. If Kevin loses his job, the debt doesn't stop. It continues to accrue at high interest rates. The state has moved from being a judge to being an automated ledger. When Kevin eventually falls behind because of an industry shift, the state doesn't just take his freedom. It takes his ability to function in society. They revoke his professional license to practice law or medicine, they revoke his passport, and they flag his credit score so he can never buy a home. The cage has become invisible, but it is far more efficient than any 1930s lockup. Now, project this trajectory into the year 2026. Imagine a man named Marcus. Marcus lives in a world where the domestic relations law of 1932 has been fully integrated with the predictive analytics of 2026. The state no longer waits for Marcus to miss a payment. Using behavioral economics and predictive modeling, the court's AI analyzes Marcus's spending habits. If the algorithm detects that Marcus is spending more on personal hobbies than the court deems appropriate, or if he moves to a lower-paying job for a better quality of life, the system automatically triggers a capacity to earn audit. In 2026, the state doesn't just want the money. It wants to ensure that Marcus remains a high-yielding economic unit for the duration of the child's minority. The potential outcomes for Marcus are a state of permanent financial transparency where every cent earned and spent is scrutinized by a government that views him as a tax-producing asset first and a father second. This historical retrospective reveals that the Great Depression was the forge where the modern relationship between the father and the state was hammered out. The men who organized in the alimony jails were the first to realize that in the eyes of the law, their value was often reduced to a numerical figure. The shift from the tender years doctrine to the best interests of the child standard was supposed to be a win for fathers, but without a presumption of equal shared parenting, it often became a subjective tool for judges to maintain the status quo while increasing the financial stakes. The data from the last 90 years shows that even as women's workforce participation surged and gender roles evolved, the financial structures of divorce remained rooted in the emergency measures of the 1930s. We must look at the step-by-step evolution of how we got here. Step 1 was the criminalization of poverty during the initial crash. Step 2 was the federalization of support during World War II to stabilize the home front. Step 3 was the psychological pathologization of fathers during the Cold War to enforce conformity. Step 4 was the automation of debt collection through the IRS and Social Security systems in the late 20th century. And Step 5, where we sit now in 2026, is the algorithmic management of the family unit. Each of these steps was presented as a solution to a crisis, but each one resulted in the father losing a layer of his autonomy and his direct connection to his children. The deep dive into this history serves a vital purpose for the modern viewer. It removes the illusion that our current systems are natural or inevitable. The high-conflict, high-cost litigation of 2026 is a direct descendant of the desperate battles fought for a 50-cent day pass in 1932. By understanding that the alimony jail system failed because it was mathematically impossible and morally bankrupt, we can begin to question the current systems that still rely on those same outdated premises. We see that the struggle for fathers' rights is not a modern grievance, but a century-old fight for the basic constitutional recognition that a man's worth cannot be measured solely by his bank balance. The most profound lesson from the fathers of the Great Depression is the power of collective resistance and the necessity of legal literacy. Those men didn't get out of jail by pleading for mercy. They got out by studying the Constitution and forcing the state to face its own contradictions. They proved that even in the darkest economic periods, the principles of due process and equal protection must be defended, or they will be discarded by a government seeking the path of least resistance. As we move forward into an era of unprecedented technological and economic change, the resilience of those fathers remains our most important guide. We have explored the hunger strikes, the hobo jungles, the military allotments, and the psychological evaluations. We have seen how the state uses crisis to expand its reach, and how individuals use crisis to find their voice. But the story doesn't end here. The legacy of the 1930s is still being written in the courtrooms of 2026. The next phase of this movement is already beginning, fueled by a new generation of fathers who are utilizing decentralized technology to bypass the very systems that were built to contain them. In our next deep dive, we will move beyond the historical retrospective and into the future of family law. We will examine the rise of private mediation, the impact of artificial intelligence on custody determinations, and the growing movement to abolish the Title IV incentives that have driven the child support machine for decades. We will look at how the lessons of the Great Depression are being applied to the digital age to finally create a system that prioritizes the bond between parent and child over the collection of state-mandated debt. The era of the alimony jail may be over, but the era of the empowered, informed, and technologically savvy father is just beginning. What happens when the state can no longer track the money, and the fathers no longer accept the cage? The answers will redefine the American family for the next 100 years.